The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers, because taxpayers have a right to know what they get from their government. Our job is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizens watchdogs to protect the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is our mission statement. As I look around the room, I feel fairly safe to say everyone here supports the Postal Service. The real question is not whether, but how to best reform postal delivery in order to bring fiscal stability to the Post Office. In two Congresses, the committee has led on postal reform, comprehensive reform that, from CBO scoring, would bring financial stability to the Post Office and, in fact, end the bleeding of red ink. I still firmly believe that the current bill, H.R. 2748, would be the best path to postal reform and to save the Post Office. H.R. 2748 will make difficult but common-sense reforms that enable a troubled agency to right-size itself. Any delay in necessary cost-cutting reforms will only result in greater debt, greater burden that will limit flexibility for the Postal Service in the years to come. You can never glean the intent of colleagues to your left or right from this position. What you do know is there has been a reluctance to make the reforms that need to be made, and these are bipartisan. It seems that any reform that would reduce the size of the workforce, even through attrition, is opposed by my Democratic colleagues. In the Senate, there seems to be a consistent pattern that postal reform is necessary as long as it closes no post offices and no processing centers anywhere in the State of each and every Senator. This challenge is created by the necessary and, if you will, understandable legacy of the Post Office. This is a legacy that goes back to my youth, in which the Post Office delivered 7 days a week, twice a day on many days, and ultimately we relied on first-class mail for virtually every business transaction. I might note that in my youth, the Postal Service was smaller than it is today and rose from the 60s through today and has fallen only over the last decade as there has been a precipitous drop in first-class mail and even in other mail. But there is a bright future for the Post Office. Package delivery is likely to continue as e-commerce becomes the standard and the norm in greater amounts. But it brings a challenge, and a challenge that I believe today we can discuss in light of the President's fiscal 2015 budget proposal, which includes many of, but not all, of the most necessary changes. One of them, which will be discussed today, will be ending the very light Saturday delivery, something that is a legacy, as was Sunday delivery, of the past. But buried within the budget, I note that without a score, that in fact the Administration recognizes that door delivery ceased in 1974 for further expansion needs to contract. 2 out of 3 homes in America do not receive delivery at the door, while the cost of 1 out of 3, less than 1 out of 3 homes receiving delivery to a chute or the door or the stoop, in fact, costs $6.5 billion to the Post Office every year in excess labor. Recently, I visited a home here in Washington, D.C. In a suburban area of D.C., large lawns and more than 30 steps leading to the front door. Those steps were uphill from a street in which virtually all of the residents parked on the street and few had garages. reminded me of the fact that these homes built in the 1940s, if they were built today, would have secure mailboxes or conventional mailboxes at their door. And yet the Post Office has done absolutely nothing to alleviate a postal worker walking up 30 steps times 30 homes every day. These steps, as you can imagine, this past winter were snow and ice filled day after day after day. An unnecessary risk to the postal delivery person, and, quite frankly, a complete waste of labor. So although that is not an element, and it may not be part of any compromise, I have continued to try to educate this committee that cluster boxes located in neighborhoods like that would be easy to install, more efficient for the Post Office, but most importantly, since the future of the Post Office is brightest in delivery of small packages, the ability to lock a small package so it not disappear or become damaged on that door, on that stoop in a neighborhood like the one I visited, clearly would be beneficial to the consumer and ultimately beneficial to the Post Office's product quality delivery. I could dwell on the many items that we have come up short on in the past. I choose not to. Today we have a representative of the Office of Management and Budget on behalf of the President's proposal, which includes a number of proposals that the postal labor unions have asked for, and a few proposals that the Administration and I agree on that come from our side of the aisle. It is my goal to hear out in this hearing today our witness and to embrace, to the greatest extent possible, the entire proposal from the Administration. I would hope through that embracing we could get a floor on a vote here on a bipartisan basis, a vote on a bipartisan basis on the House floor, and get into conference where we could, in fact, make the President's budget proposal a reality. And with that, I yield to the Ranking Member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for convening this hearing today and to enable us to review the President's fiscal year 2015 budget proposals for the Postal Service. The Postal Service remains the link that holds all corners of our nation together. It delivers mail to more than 150 million addresses nationwide and maintains a network of approximately 32,000 post offices. However, as we well know, declining mail volumes have reduced the Postal Service's revenues, even as it continues to be statutorily required to make multi-billion-dollar annual payments into a fund to cover future retiree health benefits, a requirement no other agency has. The Postal Service has now defaulted on nearly $17 billion in retiree health benefit payments, and it will default on the payment due at the end of September of this year. The Postal Service's cash position has improved. However, due largely to increased parcel and package volumes, which grew by 6% between fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013. Parcels and packages now account for almost one-fifth of the Postal Service's revenues. The President's budget proposes several operational reforms that the Administration believes would provide significant relief to the Postal Service and place it on firmer financial footing over the long term. Many of these proposals echo provisions contained in legislation I and Congressman Lynch have previously offered. For example, H.R. 2690, which I introduced last year, would recalculate the Postal Service's liability to the Federal Employees Retiree System on the basis of a demographic assumptions that better reflect the unique characteristics of the Postal Service's workforce. The President's budget endorses this proposal. The President's budget also would return to the Postal Service the overpayments it has made into the retirement system. The President's budget also supports the restructuring of the Postal Service's payments into the Retiree Health Benefits Fund. The Administration indicates the plan it has offered would provide $9 billion in cost savings. The President's budget would make permanent the exigent rate increase recently approved by the Postal Regulatory Commission. The Postal Service already has the authority to convert addresses receiving door delivery to curbside or centralized delivery. I believe the Postal Service should continue to make such conversions where they make sense and where neighborhoods support this change. I agree with the Chairman that such moves would help, hopefully, to save our postal workers from injuries and from difficult circumstances. New addresses should continue to be required to receive curbside or centralized delivery. Ultimately, I believe that the delivery frequency should be considered in the context of comprehensive postal reform legislation. Given the concerns of our colleagues on both sides of the aisle, any consideration of changes to the frequency of delivery should be the subject of a robust debate involving all stakeholders. As I close, I commend the Administration for supporting comprehensive postal reform and offering a thoughtful package of policy proposals for our consideration. As we proceed, I hope we will focus on measures we can all agree on rather than measures that drive us apart. It has been more than 8 months since the committee marked up the Chairman's postal reform measure. Since then, the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee has passed a bipartisan reform bill. Although I don't agree with everything in the Senate's bill, it offers the bipartisan starting point from which we could craft a measure that will ensure the Postal Service is positioned to succeed while serving the changing needs of its customers. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the subcommittee chairman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm really glad we're having this hearing today. I think what we're going to find today is that the President and what we passed 8 months ago out of this committee is very close. We're not that far off. We're in agreement on most of the major issues. But, we need to take an overall look. While the Internet's been a boom for the nation and the global economy, it's been a mixed blessing for the Postal Service. Package volume is growing rapidly thanks to e-commerce, but that impressive growth has not been nearly enough to offset the decline in letters. Americans are rapidly changing how they communicate with one another and how they pay their bills. The Postal Service has struggled to adapt. However, this does not mean we're living in a non-postal world. The Postal Service is a vital link in our economy, connecting even the most remote parts of this company. That's why postal reform is so important. We can't just move bits and bytes around. We need to be moving atoms around. It's absolutely critical. As the President stated in their budget, there can be no doubt the Postal Service is in need of reform. Today, the trouble agency stands in default to the Treasury for $16.7 billion, and without substantial changes from current law, the agency now admits it will not be able to address its more than $100 billion in unfunded obligations over the long term. Last July, this committee passed the Postal Reform Act of 2013, and unfortunately, we didn't get the bipartisan support that we were looking for. I thought we'd worked pretty strongly with the minority here, but we weren't able to get a bipartisan bill. Hopefully, finding out the pieces that we agree on from the President's budget today will allow us to get the bipartisan support we need. I do, however, want to take a second to correct the ranking member. I guess he has not reviewed the transcript from our subcommittee hearing of a couple of weeks ago. The Postal Service is, in fact, not the only government agency required to accrue for future health benefits. The Department of Defense is also required to accrue for TRICARE for life, so that management within the Pentagon would be aware of the cost of current-day decisions on long-term financial interest. Getting back to the other issues in postal reform, where the savings can be. The President agrees that door-to-door delivery is too expensive. In our legislation, we came up with a solution that would continue door-to-door service for the elderly and disabled, and we could come up with a way to pay for that if you wanted to do it. You pay a fee and you continue to get the mail at your mail. But it's no question it's more cost effective to do what we're doing in new subdivisions now. Cluster box or curbside mail, like the typical boxes where the postal worker does not need to get out of his or her car to deliver those. It's safer and faster. I'm also glad to see the President's continued support for 5-day delivery of mail, a change that was supported by the American people. You know, I can't believe we are still debating this. We came up with a great compromise where packages would be delivered on Saturday so we could get around the problem of people needing their medications delivered and still save lots of money. Unfortunately, Postal Service was moving that way, and they bowed to political pressure and backed off of it, and that's just not good. My fear as a government watchdog, a taxpayer, and as a postal customer is that without reform, the American people are going to be left footing the bill for a taxpayer bailout of the Postal Service. That's the last thing we need right now. Okay, maybe it's a policy debate we need to have, but I think you'd find consensus on both sides of the aisle within these tight budgetary times. We just don't need to be bailing out the Postal Service. As the chairman of the Subcommittee on Federal Workforce, U.S. Postal Service, and the Census, I'm committed to continuing to work with the Postal Service and members of this committee to bring the necessary reforms to bring the Postal Service into the 21st century. I truly believe there are smart ways that the Postal Service can lower its cost and improve its service. I hope we can bring them to light today and find a way that we can work with the President, members of the other party, the Postal Service, their customers, and all of their stakeholders, which basically includes all the American people, to find a solution that works, that gives us a 21st century Postal Service that can carry its own financial weight, can be a boon to our economy, get those atoms delivered on time, get us the quality of service that we need and deserve nationwide at an affordable cost. And I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now recognize the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for holding this hearing to examine the President's fiscal year 2015 budget proposal for the United States Postal Service. I'd also like to welcome Mr. Deese and thank him for his willingness to help the committee with its work. While I don't agree with specific parts of the President's postal budget, especially with respect to the move to 5-day delivery, I do recognize it as a thoughtful and meaningful attempt to deal with our problems. According to its most recent quarterly financial report, the Postal Service ended fiscal year 2013 with a net loss of $5 billion. The agency also endured a net loss of $354 million for the first quarter of fiscal year 2014, making it the 19th out of the last 21 quarters that it has sustained a loss. Moreover, the Postal Service has indicated that it will again default on its annual payment to pre-fund its future retiree health benefits when $5.7 billion becomes overdue after September 30th. It is against this troubling financial backdrop that the President has submitted a fiscal year 2015 budget that contains a number of proposals to address the serious fiscal challenges facing the Postal Service. In examining the various recommendations issued by the Administration, and as we continue to undertake the critical task of reforming the Postal Service, it is imperative that we bear in mind that the agency has recently demonstrated an ability to grow revenue while operating under very difficult financial conditions. According to Postal Service testimony before our committee last month, fiscal year 2013 witnessed the first revenue growth for the agency since 2008, including a $923 million increase in package business, that's about an 8% increase, and a $487 million increase in standard mail, that's about 3% of volume. Executive Vice President Jeff Williamson noted that growth in our, this is a quote, growth in our package business was fueled by our priority mail simplification and enhancement efforts. We also formed a strategic partnership with Amazon to test Sunday package delivery in select markets, and we are exploring similar partnerships with other companies. This indicates that the path to greater financial viability for the Postal Service does not lie in service reductions, the degradation of our existing mail network, or arbitrary workforce cuts. Rather, we are seeing that the Postal Service can experience profitability when it capitalizes on the distinct business features that have long set the agency apart from its competitors. I am referring to an extensive and unparalleled mail network and a dedicated workforce that is ready, willing, and able to provide personalized service to the American people 6 days a week, and now even on Sundays. That is what the customer wants. Meaningful postal reform must not degrade the exceptional service standards that have come to define the Postal Service, but instead afford the agency the operational and financial flexibility to build upon what it already does best. That is why I remain steadfast in my opposition to a transition to 5-day mail delivery. Although I concede that where appropriate, it may be possible in some rural and suburban areas to convert from door delivery to curbside delivery, again, where appropriate. Rather, I think we should focus on common-sense reform that will only strengthen the Postal Service, and I am encouraged that the President has again recommended for Congress to require the Office of Personnel Management to return to the Postal Service the surplus amount that it has overpaid for its share of Federal employees' retirement costs. As noted by the Administration, the Office of Personnel Management should be required to calculate this surplus using an actuarial formula based on the specific demographics of postal employees. I want to use the last minute just to talk about the statement that the ranking member may have been wrong in singling out the Postal Service as the only agency that is required to pre-fund its employee health benefits going forward. The chairman of the subcommittee, who is a great friend of mine, indicates that DOD also is required to pre-fund their health benefits in advance. However, I want to point out a major distinction that clearly sets this apart. DOD, Department of Defense, provides advance payment of their health care benefits for retirees because Congress issues an appropriation. We give them the money to do it each and every year. That's why they provide their health benefits in advance. We do not provide an appropriation for the Postal Service. We let them sell stamps. That is quite different than, the suggestion that the ranking member was off base on that is completely wrong. And DOD gets an appropriation from the House and Senate, and that is why they pay for their health benefits in advance. With that, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate your indulgence, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Never an indulgence. We now welcome our witness, the Honorable Brian Deese. He is the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget. Mr. Deputy Director, if you would please rise pursuant to our committees to take the oath. And raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Please be seated. Let the record reflect the witness answered in the affirmative. Since you are the main show today, we will not gavel you at 5 minutes. Your entire opening statement is placed in the record without objection, and you are free to use more or less the 5 minutes in any way you would like. You are recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member, and members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss the President's proposal for reform of the U.S. Postal Service. The Administration recognizes the value of the Postal Service to our nation's commerce and communications, and its essential role in connecting America with the global economy. We also recognize that for years the Postal Service is ranked among the most trusted Federal agencies, and that's because they provide universal service to millions of Americans that is both reliable and affordable. Unfortunately, the Great Recession exacerbated financial pressures that the Postal Service has been facing for many years. And in recent years, the Postal Service has faced a significant financial gap and large unfunded liabilities. Given these challenges, the Administration believes there is both a need and an opportunity for legislation to provide near-term financial relief and long-term structural reform that would help ensure the future viability of the Postal Service. The proposals in the President's budget build on many of the proposals and business process reforms that the Postal Service has been implementing in recent years, and it focuses on 4 key principles that I'd like to touch on briefly today. First, the proposal provides the Postal Service with sufficient near-term financial relief to avoid destabilizing near-term measures that could undermine the Postal Service's core strengths. The Administration's proposal would improve the Postal Service's near-term cash position by more than $20 billion over the next 3 years, providing time for key legislative reforms and operating efficiencies to take effect. Second, the proposal provides the Postal Service with flexibility to adjust to a changing demand environment. In addition to the Postal Service's ongoing administrative initiatives in this area, the Administration's proposal would provide the Postal Service with market-based authorities to realign its business and operational strategies. Third, the proposal gives the Postal Service flexibility to generate additional revenue as well. This would include the authority to leverage its national network through new partnerships with state and local government entities, as well as expanding promising and profitable new lines of business. Finally, the Administration's proposal would build on, rather than undermine, the Postal Service's core strengths. And the Administration believes that the test for any comprehensive and balanced reform proposal must be that we improve the Postal Service's quality of service, including in rural America, and the responsiveness of its products offerings to build on that trust that the Postal Service has with the American people. The Administration is gratified by the serious work of members of this committee, as well as in the Senate, to bring forward ideas and approaches to addressing the Postal Service's challenges, and we look forward to working with Congress to strengthen the Postal Service over the long term. So, as I said, it can continue to provide the American people with trusted, reliable, and affordable service. With that, I look forward to taking your questions on the Administration's Postal Service proposal.
Thank you. I'll recognize myself. And without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recess of the committee at any time. First question, first of all, in looking at the President's budget, the CBO has scored about $6.5 billion if we were to convert the remaining homes that have to-the-door or so-called chute delivery to the curb. However, in the President's budget, which usually scores higher than CBO's score for a number of reasons, you scored only $500 million in savings. I note that it was a mandate on business, well, in fact, no mandate on the private sector. In other words, if you will, residents would continue to be under the same 1974 encouragement to convert that has not led to conversion. Did you, one, get your money, your $500 million, all from a calculation of business? And if so, why would business be appropriate for a mandate in almost all cases and no residential?
I appreciate the question, and this is an important component of the Administration's plan. The difference in scoring assumptions does derive from difference in the policy assumptions or the policy proposal itself. As you note, the Administration's proposal would do a couple things in this space. The first is it would provide the Postal Service the authority to move to cluster curbside approaches with respect to businesses and with respect to new residences.
Well, no, I appreciate that, except they already have that authority. So the question is, you scored $500 million. Assume CBO makes it $250 million, about half of what you usually score. Out of $6.5 billion, if we were to do them all, and by the way, I'm supportive. I think the ranking member has more and more recognized and supported at least the idea that cluster boxes are an asset, not a liability, when they maintain your packages in a secure and water-resistant environment. But my question really was, the mandate on business, which I support, would seem like it would score at least that amount. And as a result, was there a calculation of any savings in residential? Because in order to score a savings, you have to beat the very small amount of residential reduction that's going on. So that was the specific question, is did you get it all from business?
The scoring assumption assumes that the majority of that savings comes from the conversion in the business space, with a small amount coming from residential conversions. We did not include in the Administration's proposal a mandate or a target in the residential space.
And why not, since there's been a long history of people being very happy when they got conversions to cluster boxes and secured thing, and yet there's been very little of it under the law that has been around since before most people in this room's birth.
Our rationale in that context was that while we agree that there are opportunities for potential cost savings without undermining and, in fact, potentially enhancing customer service, that it is location dependent and situation dependent. And so this is there are promising strategies that the Postal Service is deploying, but before mandating that on a wide scale at a residential level, would want to understand better.
Well, let me ask two quick questions before my time has expired, and there probably will be a second round. One is you did ask for 5-day. The administration has had that year after year after year. You're solidly in favor of that and have, I presume, had many years of public comment since it's been in the budget year after year. Is that correct?
The administration's proposal includes the authority for the Postal Service to move to 5-day delivery.
But it scores an assumption that they will do it.
It includes the assumption, and the only thing that I would note there is that it is our belief that that needs to be part of a comprehensive and balanced plan. That taken in isolation, the move to 5-day delivery doesn't solve.
And we concur with that. Would you say that the President's proposal in the budget would be considered comprehensive in the President's opinion?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So if we embrace the entire budget proposal, that would in fact be comprehensive according to the administration?
We believe that the proposal we put forward is comprehensive and balanced.
Let me ask one last question, an exit question related to the cluster boxes. Would the administration consider it reasonable to go from what is stated, which is the mandatory for business, voluntary for residents, to mandatory for business, mandatory for residents which are substantially the same or identical to existing post-1974 implementations? In other words, recognize that if your home was designed, your residence was designed substantially differently in the pre-1974 era, right here in Washington, these row homes would be kind of a unique design that often does not easily facilitate a cluster box. But if you're living in a classic residential or rural area and it simply happened to have been built before 1974, would the administration be prepared to negotiate, obviously with us, but to agree that if it's the same as implementations post-1974 in large amounts, that pre-1974 should be mandated? In other words, fairness between somebody that has an identical community, except this street was built in 75 and this one was built in 72.
That's a specific proposal that we haven't looked closely at. Would be happy to do so. The broader policy concern that we have that we'd want to understand better is whether imposing a mandate in this context would create untenable situations in particular locations. But that specific proposal we'd be happy to look at.
Well, I would appreciate that, and I'll yield to the Ranking Member in just a moment and give him the additional time. The reason I ask that is that we consider in some point that that is essentially a voluntary, where not the same as millions of Americans have now had for generations. And if a home built in 1975, the goose or gander kind of thing, if since 1975 somebody has lived with it and it works, then a home substantial, let's just say on the same street but further down, that was built in the 60s, why wouldn't you convert it if it was substantially the same? And the language that I propose that we enter into a negotiation with the administration on would limit the mandate to those in which it was substantially similar, so that there would be no injustice, but rather a bringing to justice what has obviously worked in the last 50 years, or almost 50 years since the law, would then be considered it must already be considered to work if it's substantially identical, or some language that would be agreed to. And that would be what I would pose, because I believe that the proposal of the administration could be enhanced in scoring substantially if we were to take those like residents and bring them in a 10-year period to identical. If you could take that back, and thank the Ranking Member for his indulgence and yield 7 minutes.
On Wednesday, April 2nd, the Budget Committee Chairman, Paul Ryan, unveiled his fiscal year 2015 budget. Included in the Chairman's budget was a proposal requiring postal employees to pay increased costs for health and life insurance. The budget would also subject Postal employees to additional pension contribution rates that would be applied to all Federal employees. Currently, Postal employees' contributions to health and life insurance are subject to collective bargaining. Has the Administration reviewed the Chairman's budget proposal, and if so, could you provide any feedback on that proposal?
We have not seen the full detail of the Chairman's budget proposal, so we have not had an opportunity to review the specifics. We'd be happy to do so and get back to you.
One of my key, how soon can you get that back to me? I'm just curious.
Happy to work on it as quickly as we can and get back to you shortly.
All right. One of my key priorities for postal reform is the creation of a Chief Innovation Officer position in the Postal Service. This individual would be tasked with leading the development of innovative postal and non-postal products and services within the Postal Service to meet customers' changing needs and to generate additional revenues. Would the Administration support the creation of such a position?
That provision isn't specifically in the Administration's plan, but the objectives are quite consistent with a number of the proposals in the plan, and encouraging innovation, particularly in new product areas, and creating new potential revenue opportunities is something that we do support. So that's something that we would be open to and happy to work with you and others on the committee on.
Now, the Administration's proposal for the Postal Service, one of the many operational reforms included was, and I quote, allowing the Postal Service to leverage its resources by increasing collaboration with State and local governments. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And how do you see them doing that?
I think that the Postal Service's network across the country is a vital asset, and one that they have already found some ways to take advantage of. For example, the processing of passport applications in post offices has been something that's enhanced customer service and customer satisfaction. And I think there are opportunities to build on that model and provide opportunities to provide other licenses or other State and local services and co-locate those in post offices that would both create customer efficiencies and also potentially create new revenue opportunities for the Postal Service as well.
Now, does the Administration believe that innovation or collaborations with other entities could yield additional revenue for the Postal Service? I mean, you just talked about passports. I don't know how much revenue is there. And then the question becomes, are some of these proposals revenue neutral? Of course, as you well know, that when the Postal Service comes up with new ideas, a lot of times there are already entities in the private sector that become concerned because they see it as competing against what they're doing. And in many instances, they feel that the Postal Service has an advantage over them because of the very network that you just talked about. So I'm just wondering, did you all consider the types of entities that, other than passports? I mean, the other services, that is.
Yeah. I think that you raise an important point, and I think that it's an important question to ask for any potential expansion into a new product or service line, given the position of the Postal Service, its unique position, its monopoly position in some business segments, whether or not we would inadvertently create adverse competitive dynamics for private sector entities. Our focus on collaborating with State and local entities was principally driven by the fact that most all of those services are governmental in nature, and so they're not things that would raise concerns about competitive dynamics. With respect to expanding beyond that into other services, that's a concern that we share and one that we'd want to look closely at to make sure, if they were expanding, that we weren't tripping up or undermining legitimate private sector business segments.
Now, recently the Postal Service's Inspector General released a white paper indicating that the Postal Service could potentially generate billions of dollars in additional revenue by providing non-bank financial services to underserved communities. I'm very familiar with underserved communities, because I'm living in one and have been there for 32 years where there are no banks. So, I mean, did you all review the IG report?
I'm familiar with the IG report, and generally speaking, the administration, the President's obviously very committed to that policy goal of trying to expand access to banking services, particularly in underserved areas where they are unable to access or only able to access at extremely high costs and high risk to individual consumers. With respect to leveraging the postal network, that's not something that is part of our proposal currently. I know there's proposals out there, and we have been looking at them. I think that's a space where we want to better understand the impact, both in terms of the potential competitive dynamics, but also in terms of the leveraging the strengths and the assets of the Postal Service itself. So that's a place where we haven't incorporated that into the administration's plan, but we want to learn more from the proposals that are out there.
Mr. Chairman, I yield the gentlelady, Ms. Maloney, the remainder of my time.
The gentleman yields.
Friend and the ranking member for yielding. There is a meeting with the President on his Women's Economic Agenda today very shortly, so a number of us will be going to that meeting, and this is an incredibly important hearing. The Postal Service is so fundamental to this country. I believe the mail should be delivered on time every day, including Saturday. It's a critical part of our economy and a critical part of people's lives. The one area that I find completely troubling is the Postal Service is required to make fixed annual payments of between $5.4 billion and $5.8 billion over 10 years to pre-fund the cost of future retiree health benefits for current employees and retirees. No other agency in the whole government is required to do this. This is incredibly unfair. Not only do they have to, and do they, deliver mail to every corner of this country on time, every day, including Saturday, they have to pre-fund their benefits. So I just want to go on record on how terribly unfair this is and that it needs to be changed. And I will be reading the reviews and meeting with the Chairman on and the ranking member on the outcome of this important hearing. I yield back to the ranking member.
Are there any other women that will be attending, having to leave with the gentlelady? With the indulgence of the majority, you are now recognized, please.
Thank you. That's very nice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Actually, with what my colleague just said, I can say ditto, ditto, ditto. I do think it should stay 6 days a week, and I do think we should relook at how pensions are paid. So I couldn't agree with the statement that was just made. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. And since I'm getting a little indulgence from the ranking member, could I have 1 minute to follow up on what the ranking member had said? The ranking member talked about this proposal on banking, and obviously it's not in the President's budget, but I want to just ask a question on consistency. If the State of Maryland, in partnership with Maryland post offices, Baltimore and so on, chose to have a government-sponsored partnership that accessed those, that would be, if I understand correctly, consistent with the President's proposal. In other words, working with State and local governments, if a government entity were to have something and utilize postal workers as part of their plan, that would be a government-to-government plan and consistent with the President's proposal. Is that right?
The goal of expanding with State and local entities was to create space for those types of partnerships. With respect to whether those partnerships go into the issue of financial services or the issue of licensing or otherwise, we aren't prescriptive on that in the proposal, but the idea is to focus on areas where you could find the intersection.
Right. But if the post office were to run an unemployment office, for example, an annex to an unemployment office on behalf of a State, that would be clearly consistent with the President's proposal, because that would be inherently governmental.
Those are the types of services that were contemplated, obviously, with respect to the specifics. That's the kind of business judgment we would want to leave to the Postal Service.
I thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg.
I thank the Chairman. And Mr. Deese, thank you for being with us today. The President's budget calls for a codification of the Postal Service's current plan to avoid closing many small rural post offices like the one that services my home by reducing their hours of operation to either 2, 4, or 6 hours per day. As part of the additional efforts to protect rural access to postal services, the committee's bill includes an amendment crafted by Representative Adrian Smith that would limit the total number of rural post office closures to less than 5% of the total number of remaining rural post office per year. The question I would ask you is, how strongly would the Administration support this proposal?
Well, I think you put your finger on a key part of the Administration's proposal, which is to actually codify in law the Postal Service's plan, the post plan that they have developed. And the Administration believes that that strategy is financially sensible and supports one of the key principles that we believe should be part of any plan, which is to strengthen the Postal Service's core assets. And one of its core assets is its network, including its network in rural America. And so the approach that we would codify would seek to avoid post office closures in rural areas altogether by implementing alternative strategies, as you mentioned. So we support that effort, and we believe that from a financial viability perspective, it's neither necessary nor necessarily wise to go forward with substantial closures in the future.
In your written testimony, you state that under the Administration's proposal, the Postal Service is not being relieved of its retiree health care benefits, responsibilities, or the requirement to pay its liabilities, and I quote, "This approach appears to implicitly reject a push by some of my Democratic members and colleagues to ask the USPS to only fund 80% of the cost of these benefits. Can you explain why the Administration believes that the Postal Service should fully fund its retiree health care costs and not only 80%?
Well, I think this dovetails back to the points by Congressman Maloney as well. We believe that the current structure of fixed retiree health benefit payments is unsustainable. At the same time, we think it's important as part of a comprehensive reform to put the Postal Service in a position where it is financially viable enough to meet its long-term obligations. And so the approach that we would take would be to restructure those payments in the near term, basically defer the full payment in 2014 and half of the payment, the scheduled fixed payment in 15 and 16, but build those into a 40-year amortization schedule. And when you take that approach in the context of the other reforms in the President's plan, we believe that that 40-year amortization schedule is sustainable for the Postal Service to meet. And so I think that our view is that what we want to do is try to put the Postal Service in a position to meet its obligations over the long term, but that needs to be balanced against the realities in the short term that without some near-term relief, they will continue defaulting on their obligations.
Well, along with that, has the Administration taken a position on the Postal Service's proposal that all postal retirees be required to enroll in Medicare once they reach the eligibility age for Medicare?
That isn't a proposal we've taken a formal position on. The focus of our proposal with respect to health care and health care liabilities has been trying to address the financial viability issue that we just discussed. And so that is a near-term challenge because of the looming retiree health benefit payments. And so with respect to modifying the source of the health care itself or modifying the benefit structure itself, that's not something that we've taken a position on. It's something that we know others have raised and we are looking at. And the one note I would make from the OMB perspective and from the administration-wide perspective is, as we look at proposals of that type, it's important to make an assessment on a whole-of-government unified basis in terms of the fiscal impact that they would have. So we haven't taken a formal position, but we are looking at those closely.
Thank you. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welsh.
Thank you very much. The most important thing is that at the end of the day, we have to have a strong and vital Postal Service. And the Postal Service has been here longer than the United States Constitution. There's enormous pressures on the Postal Service now. Obviously, the Internet has really cut into first-class mail, but the telegraph cut into Pony Express. I mean, there's a lot of adjustments that had to be made over the year. And any approach that we take, offered by the White House, offered by this committee, should have as the goal the strengthening of the Postal Service for the long term. My view is that while there's enormous price pressures, the reforms we have cannot be ones that ultimately undercut the capacity of the Postal Service to provide the unique service it does. 6-day delivery, in my view, is very important. I'm from a rural area, so folks in rural Vermont, all over Vermont, really depend on that Saturday delivery. So my hope is that at the end of the day, we're going to maintain that 6-day delivery. One of the questions that I have of you, Mr. Deese, is whether on the funding issue that some of my colleagues have brought up, where we have situations in government, in some State governments all around, where sometimes pensions and medical expenses are underfunded, and that creates a huge problem, but sometimes they're overfunded, and that creates a huge problem, a cash flow for the Postal Service. Where do you all stand on the funding levels for these pensions and the obligations that the Postal Service has that are kind of constricting their cash flow and their ability to operate?
Thank you for that. And I would just say at the outset that the Administration agrees strongly with your bottom line principle that we need to be focused on a stronger Postal Service. With respect to the pension and other outstanding liabilities, it is important to look liability by liability because it differs. With respect to the pension obligations in the FERS system, for example, that's a place where we believe that if calculated accurately based on postal-specific characteristics, there is a surplus and the Postal Service has overpaid. Our proposal would rebate those resources back.
Right. That's great. So we'd right-size the obligation. That would be actuarially sound, but not bone-crushing for the cash flow of the Postal Service. That's the goal, right?
Yeah, and that's right. And I think that you have to look at these pieces together because if a reform proposal doesn't achieve sufficient near-term financial relief, then it's not going to allow time and space for reforms to take effect, nor will it allow for the Congress and the Administration to actually solve this problem, and we may be back here again.
Thank you. A couple of other things. What about, we've got to maintain the overnight delivery standards. I mean, one of the great things about any organization is when they can provide the service that the customers need. Overnight delivery really is important to the Postal Service to be customer friendly. And number two, in this time where there's enormous pressure, loss of first-class mail from the Internet, there's got to be some freedom to innovate. I mean, our companies that do well are the ones that adapt. Where is the Administration with respect to maintaining overnight delivery standards and giving some flexibility and freedom to the Postal Service to innovate and find other ways to generate revenue to make that Postal Service strong?
Well, with respect to the second piece on innovation, we agree that it's important to provide additional flexibility and additional authorities for the Postal Service to innovate and to expand where they have identified promising new business lines, for example, in the delivery of beer and wine. And with respect to the question of overnight delivery, I think we believe it's important to maintain the quality of service that customers have come to rely on, and that has to be an integral part of making any of these reforms.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Deese. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Would the gentleman yield?
I will yield, yes.
Thank you. I think the gentleman from Vermont made a good point. But earlier when the gentlelady from New York had talked about pre-funding, from the Administration's perspective, because your proposal, as I understand it, of course, is to essentially reschedule that pre-funding, but not eliminate it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that's because ultimately these expenses come due, and the revenue of selling stamps is where those eventual bills are to be paid. Is that correct?
It's important that the Postal Service is in a financial position to meet those obligations, because those are obligations that their workforce is expecting.
Consistent with any other pension and retirement program in the private sector.
Yes, and on the question of pre-funding, obviously, to the degree that pre-funding is financially viable, it is a wise financial decision. We have a situation in the short term where the current law pre-funding obligations are untenable. So the Administration's proposal is focused on a 40-year amortization schedule that would be more tenable.
So your proposal is more based on their ability to pay today, but still trying to eventually get them actuarially sound. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. We now go to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Farenthold.
Thank you very much. And as the chairman of the subcommittee, I want to talk about where we agree and disagree, and maybe do this on big picture items so we know where to focus. I assume you're familiar with the bill we've passed out of this committee and the reforms in it?
Yes, Congressman.
All right. So what parts do you specifically disagree with that you think need additional work to be consistent with what the Administration is after?
I think there are several provisions where there are ideas or proposals that are not incorporated in the Administration's plan. A couple of them that I think we have touched on. One is the treatment of the cluster box and curbside delivery approach, and the degree to which that is mandated into the existing residential customer base or not. I think there is a second question that has come up in this conversation about the question of governance and the idea from the ranking member's legislation of a Chief Innovation Officer, and whether and to what degree we need to create a new or separate layer of oversight or governance in order to give the Postal Service the flexibility to build on the ideas and the proposals that it is already committed to. And I think that there are also some disagreements or areas where the Administration's proposal doesn't go in the space of collective bargaining and workplace protections, where it is the Administration's view that if you look at what the Postal Service management has been able to do constructively with its workforce over the last couple of years, deploying creative tools, finding savings, that it's not necessary in the current context to be prescriptive about future collective bargaining agreements. Those are a couple of places where I would note there are proposals that are not included in the Administration's plan.
But so we're generally in agreement. Let's kind of go through the big pictures. We're generally in agreement we don't want to close too many rural post offices if we can avoid it. Generally in agreement there. Right?
Generally in agreement, yes.
Generally in agreement with revenue enhancement, and we can call that innovation or revenue enhancement, in such a way that does not give the Postal Service an unfair competitive advantage over the private sector. I think y'all's proposal is doing more with respect to partnering with State and local governments, but we're in general agreement on that principle.
Yes, and the only thing I would note there, which we believe is important, financially important, is extending the exigent rate increase that's currently scheduled to expire, which does generate savings and is a component of our plan.
And then as far as pre-funding, I think there may be some details on the exact actuarial formulas and numbers, but I think we can agree that if we can get the math to work, that there needs to be some form of pre-funding that's affordable today, but does meet the long-term needs of the Post Office to keep its commitments to its employees. I like to tell postal workers who complain about this, don't you want to be sure there's money there for your health coverage?
I think that finding that balance is certainly a priority and one that we tried to address in our bill.
And y'all are supportive of 5-day. I think we're actually more generous in a modified 6-day than the President is proposing. Is that as far as days of delivery?
Well, with respect to the President's proposal, it would provide the authority for the Postal Service
to do nothing on Saturday if that's what they wanted to do. Is that?
Our estimates there reflect what the Postal Service has stated that it would intend to do, which includes maintaining 6-day delivery for businesses, for packages.
All right. And then so our stumbling blocks really, the other big one would be cluster boxes. And, our numbers show that modified 6-day and cluster boxes get us close to 70% of the way to balancing. Our proposal is that we go to cluster boxes wherever possible and we added, addressing some of the concerns of the minority, continuing to-home delivery for the elderly and disabled, and we're looking at potential of, if you want to pay the post office a subscription fee, we'll calculate what it costs to deliver to a home, say it's $100 a year. You can pay that and continue to get that. That seems to me to be a middle ground. Do you think that's something you could take back to the administration and say, where can we find some middle ground on this?
We're certainly happy to take it back, the proposal you just put forward as well as the proposal the Chairman put forward before. Our concern in that space is not to destabilize existing delivery, but we're happy to look at it.
And I think we're consistent with also not wanting to reduce the size of the postal workforce beyond voluntary attrition as well. Is that correct?
Our view is that the Postal Service management, working with its workforce, has found constructive tools to right-size its workforce, and that we should not be prescriptive in that space.
It looks like we're awful close on this, and I've already gone over on my time. I appreciate your testifying. Look forward to working with you, and I'm out of time, so I have nothing to yield back.
The gentleman yields back what he does not have. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Deese, the decision of the administration to move away from 6-day delivery and go to 5-day delivery, you have to acknowledge that we're going to have we're going to stop service on a day when most businesses in America, most families are operating on a 7-day, 6 or 7-day schedule. So we're moving away from the market. Do you get a sense of that at all?
I think that I appreciate the question and understand that that this is a challenging area. I think when the administration has looked at this issue, it has been in the context of the overall plan and what we're doing on the revenue side of the equation, as well as what we're doing on the financial relief side of the equation.
Okay, let's talk about the operational side of the equation. If you're going to use less letter carriers, you're not going to be delivering on Saturday. I assume that's the day. That's pretty much what we've talked about here when we go from 6 to 5. So you've got all these letter carriers because regardless of what we do, the mail has to get delivered. It has to get delivered, whatever mail is there. So that's a challenge. It's a physical challenge. So we're going to have less letter carriers that we need to deliver, especially if these other changes, cluster boxes and going away from door-to-door delivery. Have you thought about an early retirement incentive to get letter carriers out the door? They have not had the letter carriers I'm speaking of specifically have not had an offer of early retirement because we need them. We can't give the letter carriers an early retirement up to now because that's the only way we get the mail delivered. Have you thought about, and I'm thinking especially about the $12.5 billion that would be a surplus from the overpayment that these postal employees made to their retirement system? There's $12.5 billion sitting there. My calculation, there would be less than $1 billion to do a serious early retirement incentive for members of the National Association of Letter Carriers and rural carriers as well.
That's not a specific proposal that we've looked at, but we'd be happy to look more closely at it going forward. I think that just one note on this is that it is important, and we believe consistent with what Congressman Welch raised about coming out with a stronger postal service, that we also need to look at places where there's expansion opportunity.
Let's talk about that because that's my next question. Right now, we operate the postal service that goes to every American home and business 6 days a week, and we have the census. And the most expensive part of the United States Census is the last portion where we send census workers out to every American home separately in pursuit of the census. And I'm just wondering if the administration had thought about using letter carriers who know these routes anyway and go to these homes the other 6 days of the week, to use them to actually take over that responsibility that the census is paying for separately right now. And maybe even we could pull in some of the retirees who also know these routes very effectively, and reduce our costs both to the census and to the Postal Service. So we're saving money for the postal customer, and we're saving money for the taxpayer as well. Have you thought about that?
That's a creative idea. It's not one that we have, again, looked closely at, but again, one that we'd be happy to look at.
Okay. Let me just jump over to door delivery. You've acknowledged, I think rightfully, that there's probably ways we can more efficiently provide for delivery in rural areas that might be amenable and suitable for cluster box delivery, and I think that will happen. Have you looked at the Chairman's bill, H.R. 2748?
Yes, sir.
Now, he suggests that by 2022, we're going to convert over 75% of folks who are getting their mail delivered at the door. That's 38 million people. He's suggesting that 30 million of those people by 2022 in his bill would go to a cluster box. And just looking at the demographics in this country, urban areas will have to be converted. There's just not enough people in the rural areas. That's why they call them urban. There are lots of people there. Places like, South Boston and Dorchester, places like Baltimore, Maryland, where the houses are attached and there's no place to put a cluster box. I'm just wondering if you think that that's realistic in terms of trying to convert out of 38 million door delivery points, that we're going to convert 30 million of those to cluster boxes.
Well, while we do
the gentleman's
have
time
a
has
cluster box
expired, but you can answer.
We do have a cluster box component to the proposal, to the administration's proposal. That is a place where we do have concerns, and concerns specifically about putting a hard target or mandate on conversion rate. I think as we've discussed here, that there are challenges where in some geographic locations you can enhance service and save money through these types of approaches, and we're supportive of the Postal Service looking for additional areas, but mandating that on a broad scale could create unintended consequences, which I think we'd like to avoid.
I appreciate that, and I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mica.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deese. It appears more and more that the funding of the postal operations is turning into a big Ponzi scheme and not paying bills that are coming due and not actually meeting our obligations. That's unfortunate, and I know you're trying to correct that. How are we keeping this afloat? I just asked staff, and they said we're not paying pre-funding the health care, I guess some retirement, worker compensation, pension. So it's all of the above we're not meeting our obligations on, right? Because, I mean, tell me the losses. The current year we're in, what's the projected loss?
Well, the loss in the prior fiscal year, FY13.
The one we're in now.
Right, the one we're in now.
Projected loss.
The projected loss, well, the projections are that the Postal Service will not make the $5.6 billion scheduled payment. I believe that the net loss will be somewhat smaller than that, but I would.
So $5 billion, I guess.
That was the.
And then last year was
about $5 billion.
$5 billion, so 10, and then in your budget you're presenting, what's your projected loss?
Well, in the administration's plan,
The budget, yeah.
and in the budget, by restructuring those retiree health benefit payments, our goal would be to, starting in FY15 and going forward.
Yeah, see, and I agree with just about everything. I go for the 5-day service. I saw your proposal. Let me ask you on the 5-day service. Now, we're having trouble getting votes out of the other side of the aisle and the other side of the Congress. Is the administration prepared to help on that 5-day issue? Are you working it?
Well, I think as we were discussing, from the administration's perspective, the issue of changing the delivery schedule to reflect demand needs to be part of an overall plan.
Again, we're going to need support to pass this. Now, the biggest thing, and I look at all your points here that I would disagree with, is refunding over 2 years projected surplus of the Postal Service Federal Retirement System. Now that talk about a Ponzi scheme. I chaired civil service, and for 4 years, probably the longest of any Republican, and the first one in 40 years. And I saw the way that was treated as a big cookie jar. There's a projected surplus about $500 million for FERS last year, but there's a deficit of $19.8 billion in CSRS, right?
The CSRS does have
a projected deficit, right?
Yes. Under current law, starting in
how can you balance something on taking money out of a retirement account or try to use it as a balance to take out money, I mean, out of an account that we need to keep every penny in we possibly can?
I think the challenge that our proposal seeks to address is that without sufficient near-term financial relief, the Postal Service—
Well, you're just stealing. You're taking money out of one account that actually should be shored up. And if I were a postal union member or employee, I would be outraged. We need to get every penny we can into CSRS because you're running almost a $20 billion deficit there. This is, again, part of this Ponzi scheme. Now, let me ask you, you got to cut losses. Where's the biggest loss now? You've lost, I wasn't here for it. They said first-class mail is down 25%, so that's continuing to lose money. I thought most of the money that was lost was in commercial mailing. Is that correct or incorrect?
Well, I think that the first-class mail continues to be profitable. The issue is declining volumes.
Okay, but we're losing, again, I've been in business. I look at where my losses are, and then I cut my losses. We may do it differently in government. We steal out of this fund to a fund that is even more in hoc. That's not the way it should happen. So the biggest loss is still in commercial mailing.
I believe that there are—
You're making money on packages and probably first class, right?
That's right.
Okay. So you got to cut your losses in commercial, right?
I think that the Postal Service is—
Because somebody's paying for this, a huge debt, or the employees are paying for it. I mean, the employees are paying for it because they're going to get screwed in the end. There's not going to be money there. And who's going to get screwed in the second tier is the taxpayer, because somebody's going to have to bail out the whole Ponzi scheme.
The administration believes strongly that one strong justification for reform is avoiding a liability that ultimately gets shifted to taxpayers down the road.
Well, again, we're willing to work with you. You all need to work, the Democrats in the House and the Senate. We need to do this. We need to secure the postal system in the United States of America. It's still a very important thing. We've got thousands of people who have worked hard all their lives, great, great people, and we got an obligation to them, not just to pay their salary, keep the system going, and then also to meet their retirement, the obligations and benefits that we've incurred. And I'm not quite over. I am now. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. I thank him for yielding back. We now go to the gentlelady from Illinois, Ms. Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield 1 minute to Mr. Connolly from Virginia.
I thank my colleague from Illinois. I just wanted to correct the record from my friend from Florida. The idea that the problem is on the Democratic side of the aisle with respect to supporting 6-day delivery is simply not correct. I would point out that the Conley-Graves resolution, Mr. Graves being a Republican, H-Res 30, has 210 co-sponsors, Republicans as well as Democrats, for the record. I thank my colleague, and I yield back to her.
Thank you. Mr. Deese, thanks so much for being here. I do have a couple of questions of clarification based on the discussions that we've had so far. Let's talk about the cluster boxes. So with new construction, new, say, housing complexes that are being built, you'll be working with the developers to put these cluster boxes throughout the neighborhoods. Is that correct?
The Postal Service would be working.
The Postal Service, yes. We got 55 inches of snow in Illinois this past winter. I still have 2 feet of snow on the ground when I left my house in a shady area in my backyard. There was no way that in my wheelchair I could have possibly made it to the corner cluster box. I just want to be sure that the discussion that we've had has touched on that these will be exemptions that will be there. Is there an actual move to make sure that is codified in some way that persons with disabilities will be exempt from the cluster boxes, even in new developments?
I think the administration believes that making sure that there are those types of accommodations in any proposal is important.
Okay. Let's hope that it's more than just a philosophy and that we actually do follow through with that, because, as I said, there's no way I could have made it out through the sidewalk under 5 feet of snow. It was taller than how tall you are sitting right there right now. The other question that I have has to do with just the philosophy of how we provide services. As you mentioned in your testimony, you believe that any postal reform must build on rather than undermine the Postal Service's core strength. That's something we definitely agree on. But I would argue that the Postal Service main core strength is its reliability and the unique mission to serve the American public, regardless of profit considerations. Don't you think it's counterintuitive to lower service standards, such as going to 5-day delivery, at a time when the Post Office desperately can't afford to lose any more businesses to competitors, such as to mail alternatives?
I think that we share the goal of trying to build on the core strengths, including the trust that the Postal Service has developed with its customer base and the universal service requirement, which makes it unique as an institution. The challenge, obviously, that the Postal Service faces is that we have a rapidly changing business environment, and the rise of the Internet and electronic communications changes the equation for the Postal Service. And so the administration's plan, while building in the authority to move toward 5-day delivery in some instances and in some segments, also looks for ways for the Postal Service to leverage those core strengths to expand into areas where the overall market segments are expanding and where the Postal Service itself has an opportunity to strengthen its relationship with its customer base. And so we are seeking to strike that balance along with giving the Postal Service the near-term financial relief and flexibility that it needs so that it doesn't keep defaulting on its obligations and we're not back here in a couple of years because we haven't given it sufficient financial flexibility.
I also wanted to mention one other thing in clarification based on the discussions that we have had, specifically the difference between the DoD retiree health care program system and how that is funded as well in comparison to the Postal Service. Yes, TRICARE for Life is a system that is pre-funded. It is appropriated for, but the other component of this is that DoD retirees actually are paid from Medicare first, and TRICARE for Life is the secondary payer. That is not the case of the U.S. Postal Service retirees. And so there's a significant difference. Do you have any estimates on what the cost savings would be if U.S. Postal Service were allowed to be the secondary payer behind Medicare?
That's actually not something that we've done a cost estimate of at the Office of Management and Budget, and I don't believe that the Congressional Budget Office has either. It is an important issue, an important question, and I know that was a component of a proposal that was introduced in the Senate. But that's an area that we are looking at currently.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Now yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Pleased to yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I thank my friend from Illinois for yielding to me. Welcome, Mr. Deese. Mr. Deese, it is said that Wayne Gretzky used to say, "I skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it has been." One has the sense, in talking about these issues, postal issues, that Mr. Donohue and his management team are always skating to where the puck was. For example, in looking at new business opportunities, let's start with the Federal Government. There's an IG report that shows that in 2011, the Federal Government Federal agencies spent $342.6 million in parcel delivery. Do you know what share of that market, that Federal market, the Postal Service had?
I do not.
1.2 million. The next year, they did a little bit better. We spent $336.9 million as a Federal Government, and the USPS share was 4.8%. I mean, 4.8 million, excuse me, about 1.5%. Growth opportunity, do you think?
It's not an area that we've looked closely at, but it does seem like on these types of spaces where you're looking at governmental functions, that the Postal Service does have opportunities. Obviously, the question is how to leverage the network and the competencies that the Postal Service has. And maybe in some cases that is more challenging, but certainly this is an area where we think the Postal Service has more opportunity.
Well, surely I think you would agree, given your hat, OMB, that this Federal business is low-hanging fruit.
We are absolutely in the business of looking for ways to reduce cost and reduce duplication.
Okay. The 6-day versus 5-day mail, as I pointed out, we now have 210 sponsors saying 6 days. That's 8 shy of an absolute majority here in the House. And it's filled with Republicans as well as Democrats. So good luck in trying to persuade Democrats that we ought to accept the administration proposal. But I'd like to know more how OMB, the executive branch, accepted this proposal. It sounded to me like from your earlier testimony, you accepted the whatever analysis there was from USPS and simply incorporated it in your initiative. Is that correct? Did you do a separate analysis on the pros and cons of going from 6 to 5?
In the context of putting a policy proposal together, the administration looked at the policy impact and of that. With respect to the scoring assumptions that generated the savings estimate in the President's budget, those scoring assumptions are based on the plan or what the Postal Service has indicated it would intend to do.
Yes. Now, you do understand that the Postal Service has failed to provide us with any analysis proving that, as a matter of fact, outside of a static model, that this is a slam dunk decision, that it's a net saver always. Given the fact that, for example, parcel delivery, package delivery, technology creates business as well as decreates business. So, yes, first-class mail is declining, but parcel delivery is actually growing very robustly. You would agree?
That's right.
Well, giving up 6 days a week may be giving up a competitive advantage. Would you at least theoretically agree that's possible?
Part of the Postal Service's plan would be to continue package delivery.
Well, I'm just citing parcels, but there could be lots of other things as well. And by the way, has the Postal Regulatory Commission looked at this new hybrid proposal? Are you aware?
I'm not aware.
Don't you think OMB might want the PRC to look at that? That's their role before you, in fact, embrace it?
Well, I think we're comfortable with the budget proposal as we've put forward. Certainly, as we go forward, would welcome input from various stakeholders.
Well, you're the Office of Management Budget. Have you done your own analysis to see whether there's a downside to going to 6 days? That, for example, the Postal Service might risk a whole line of business that drops because you're not delivering, for example, greeting card industry has said that will happen to them. Have you looked at that to make sure that the net savings is what they say it is?
We have looked at this issue to try to understand it. I think one of the things that's important about the administration's proposal is that it would—
Mr. Deese, forgive me for interrupting. I only have 17 seconds. Frankly, it doesn't look like you looked at it at all. It looks like you accepted the Postal Service at its face value, which is absent a PRC review. The last time they looked at it was 2011, but that was a different proposal. And there's no analysis showing, well, that we're looking at a static model, not a dynamic model in terms of potential growth for the Postal Service. And if we look at it in the context, just at least ask ourselves, are we giving up a competitive advantage? That question never got asked. It's just an absolute, let's lop that off and call it net savings. And it troubles me no end that this administration has accepted that at face value, absent any analysis.
The one thing that I would like to just clarify is the administration's proposal would provide the Postal Service with the authority to move to 5-day delivery in different business segments. But as circumstances change, as there are business opportunities, it doesn't mandate the conversion in any particular.
That sounds good, Mr. Deason. I know my time is up, Mr. Chairman. But we already have a Postmaster General who tried to assert the fact that he had legal authority when he clearly did not, and had been reined in on this very subject by his own postal governors, because he asserted a legal authority that most certainly did not exist and flew in the face of the will of Congress. Now, it may or may not be a good public policy decision, but Congress has written into appropriations bills, thou shalt have 6 days a week. And for the Postmaster General to defy that, which he did, without absent any legal authority, frankly saying, well, its authority is a nicety, but he's already clearly indicated he'll use that authority. So the fact of the matter is, were he to get it, were your proposal to be adopted, we'd go from 6 to 5. Is that not the case?
In certain business segments, I believe that that is the case. In others, I think that they would retain 6-day delivery.
Mr. Chairman, my time is up, and I thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I'm pleased that the next gentleman I'm about to recognize is not from Connecticut. He's from the state next door. So I'll recognize Mr. Tierney. That was about the game and all that.
Yeah, that was about the game. Thank you. Mr. Deese, thank you for being here today. In the fiscal year 2015 budget, the President requested $162 million for services rendered and revenue foregone. But the President's budget request was only $70 million. Can you explain the discrepancy there?
I'm sorry, can you clarify the particular line?
The Postal Service asked for $162 million for services rendered, but revenue foregone. The President only asked for $70 million. Why not ask for the $162 million?
I would have to get back to you on the specific discrepancy there. I know that we're continuing to provide appropriated funding for those purposes, but I'd have to get back to you on the specific.
Would you do that, please? All right. Also, the Postal Service in the most recent quarterly filing shows about $3.8 billion in unrestricted cash. Do you consider that enough of a liquidity cushion for an agency of this size?
That cash position is not sufficient to meet their current law obligations, including the retiree health benefit payments, no.
Okay. It also reached, the service reached its $15 billion borrowing limit that's permitted under law. Do you think they ought to be extended additional borrowing power?
Our view is that they need near-term financial relief. We would not do it through additional borrowing authority, but instead by restructuring the fixed payments, which are not tenable.
You also, the President's budget has a request in it for the Office of Personnel Management to return to the Postal Service the surplus amounts it paid into the FERS account, correct?
Correct.
The proposal also endorses the use of postal-specific demographics to estimate the Postal Service FERS liability. Why did you use the postal-specific demographics?
Given the size of the postal workforce and the unique demographic characteristics, we believe it's actuarially sound and appropriate to take into account those specific factors when measuring the liabilities. In this instance, that results in a surplus that we would rebate back to the Postal Service.
And the Administration's budget also proposes that $5 billion be returned to the Postal Service over the next 2 years. Why 2 years instead of 1?
This is part of the overall plan to try to provide sufficient liquidity in the short term so that the Postal Service can restructure. The retiree health benefit payment adjustments happen over that same period, and so our goal was to provide sufficient liquidity over a multi-year period so that we didn't end up with a situation where the Postal Service was flush in 1 year and stuck in the next.
Some of our colleagues have indicated that the return of the FERS surplus is to be turned a bailout. Do you agree or disagree with that, and why?
We don't agree with that assessment. The calculation of the surplus based on postal-specific demographic factors is actuarially sound. And if you look across the spectrum of the Postal Service's liabilities, there are places where they are adequately or overfunded and other places where they are underfunded. And our approach seeks to address those in kind rather than having a one-size-fits-all approach.
Well, thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And let's start a little second round and yield to members that may have additional questions. First of all, when I left off, I had talked about looking for areas that we could, where our losses are, where we could save money. I don't know if you followed some of the things I've done. Most people don't in the administration. But we, having come from a developer, private sector background, it drives me crazy to see the Federal Government sitting on valuable assets. It drives me crazy to see the Post Office sitting on valuable assets. I have not read all the administration's proposal about some alternatives for offices and for locations. And I know the Senate bill had a proposal that direct the Postal Service to examine the potential expansion of retail alternatives to post offices, which have the potential to yield further operating savings. Now, I know they're selling off some of these vacant properties or empty buildings. What brought this back to light on the Post Office is I saw I think it was last week I was home, and my property appraiser, I was asking him about surplus or vacant property in Central Florida, and he showed me this list. And most of the vacant property that he had was owned by the Postal Service. So tell me first again what you have in your proposal. I didn't see anything. And secondly, where they should go and why, if it isn't in there, was it ignored?
Just to clarify, you're distinguishing between their property versus the post offices themselves, or you're referencing both?
Both.
Both.
Yeah.
So with respect to post offices, our proposal would seek to codify the Postal Service's current plan, which looks at leveraging that network of physical locations by calibrating hours and by looking for co-location strategies rather than by downsizing the actual network itself. Our view is there are opportunities there.
Well, there are probably 1,000 opportunities to reconfigure based on the business. I come from a state of Florida, Arizona, Texas, some of the growth states. We will have needs in the future. There are also vacant properties all over. I've worked on some of them, and some of them take years. The old post office downtown, which went to GSA, sat there, half of it vacant for 15 years, half of it empty. Yep. We finally got that moving, and we'll have we're going from $8 million a year loss to a $250,000 a year guarantee for the government plus a percentage of properties. But I can take you across my district and show you property that, again, needs to be disposed or better utilized. I can show you in my former district, St. Augustine, a huge building. Flagler College has been begging to get it across the street. They don't need it. I use its usefulness, but there's nobody in the postal system that can think. They lack creativity. They lack, and the administration, I would have hoped, would at least put a proposal in that they would get some professionals to help them to do some of these things that need to be done. And it's not there, is it?
Well, with respect to the Postal Service, I think that they, outside of the post offices and other property, vacant property, warehouses, they have been looking at consolidation strategies. We don't have a specific component in the President's plan on that. I would say analogously, though, there is a proposal in the President's budget to try to have a more aggressive strategy to dispose of Federal property, generally speaking, because the concern.
Yeah, but again, the Post Office is probably one of the biggest property owners in the United States. We have thousands of properties. I'm disappointed to see that you don't have a specific proposal. I think working with the Congress, that would be something, if we ever pass a bill, that we should include to give them the ability. If they don't, and I'm telling you, I've worked with the Post Office. I'm probably one of the few members of Congress that have ever gone downtown and sat in the Postmaster General's office. When I went down there, he almost flipped out. I'd never seen one before. He knew what I looked like. He'd heard descriptions of them, but I actually appeared there, and we could get some things done. But my point being, they don't have the ability, the ingenuity to put these packages together and move forward and maximize the asset and cut the losses. Again, we have to look at where the losses are, where you've got assets that are sitting there and can be turned into cash. God, I've had in Daytona Beach, I took people up there. This is 10 years ago. The second floor of that post office has been vacant in downtown Daytona Beach for more than 10 years. Rent the thing. But again, I'm disappointed. There's still an opportunity for redemption. You can come right down this aisle and be heard. But in any event, we want you to work with us to look at how this can be done. The administration carries a big stick, and you can have positive things come from working with Congress. Now, get these guys to vote for the 5 days, and we'll be set. Yield my. Do other members seek recognition? Other members seek recognition?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Lynch. That wakes up people in the audience.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Now, Mr. Deese, I realize you've suffered enough, but I have one other question for you. The suggestion was made earlier about the relation between the surplus in FERS, the Federal Employee Retirement System, which is an obligation of the Federal Government, and the prior CSRS, which is the obligation of the prior Postal Service, that I believe the transition happened in like 1983, if I'm not mistaken. I just want to clarify something. Those are different sets of employees and different obligations. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Yeah, so you couldn't, I mean, for the people who worked under FERS, you could not take their pension money and pay it over to another group of employees who worked under the Postal Department prior to 1983. Is that correct?
We certainly don't think that that's a necessary or appropriate step to take.
I don't think it's possible. That's what I'm getting at.
That may have that barrier as well.
Yeah.
The one note on the CSRS obligations is that under current law, the Postal Service will begin making pre-funding payments on a 25-year amortization schedule. So the real challenge is to put the Postal Service on a more sound financial footing rather than to move resources into that space.
And that would happen under PAEA in 2017, is that correct?
I believed it was 2018, but I may be.
Okay. You may be right. I may be off by a year. The PAEA does require them in 2017 to go back and look at their real obligations. Right now, we basically had this $19 billion hole that has been repeated for the past 7 or 8 years. But in 2017, with all of these CSRS employees passing away, a lot of older employees, it is entirely likely, in my estimate, that that CSRS obligation will be much smaller than what we believe it to be right now. Is that your understanding?
I don't have particular visibility into the actuarial dynamics in that pool, but obviously it's important to update those actuarial estimates as time goes on and as we know more about the demographic characteristics in those pools.
All right. I don't have anything further. Thank you very much for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let me go through a sort of a closing here. My ranking member has had to step away. He may come back. But the President's proposal is broadly consistent with many Democrats, obviously, and many Republicans. It's the intention of the Chair, and I've now announced it to both sides, to embrace, to the greatest extent possible, the entire portion of the President's budget proposal. I have serious concerns with mandating the exigent increase be made permanent rather than allowing an entity that finally took the initiative to recognize it and codify it to continue doing so. That doesn't mean I would totally oppose it. It means that I kind of look and say the processes work. They put that in. But sans that, the rest of the proposal I find to be a good starting point for legislation that hopefully the Administration would broadly push all parties to embrace. But as you heard today, and you had a lot of people on both sides of the dais here talking about take-withs and take-backs. What I'd like to do is, in closing, is to ask for a process, a short process over the next 2 weeks, and that is that members of this committee would send a series of letters to OMB on various aspects. The ranking member, for example, had the question on other enterprises and trying to define whether it would be consistent with the Administration's proposal. Ms. Duckworth brought up a very good point, which was the specifics of the disabled's access if we go to clusters. I would recommend that our staff send excerpts from the earlier passed bill, which specifically had some language for access to disabled, to see whether that's consistent. But in using this dialogue, I don't want to artificially extend the President's budget, but I want to make sure that each item which is supported by the Administration and requested to be considered by either side of the dais get a letter back, a prompt fashion, a week or so whenever possible, so that after the break we could hold a markup and those comments would then be available as part of our markup in support of specific amendments or additions to the bill. Is that something that you are prepared to take back?
I'm happy to take that back and work wherever we can, too.
But we introduced you as the Honorable, so the question is, can you make it happen?
I'm happy to take that back, and we will work diligently on any requests from this committee.
Mr. Chairman,
the gentleman? Yes.
Yeah, I just want to be clear that there are some members on our side of the aisle, and I suspect that there may be members on your side of the aisle, nevertheless, that disagree with both you and the President. So we would want to be part of that dialogue as well.
And reclaiming my time, that's the reason for this closing statement is the ranking member and I agree on some things and we disagree on some things. The ranking member has some additional initiatives. Ms. Duckworth, the questions related to the pre-funding versus the FERS recapture, I know some of my folks are going to further ask it. My goal is to only include in the markup, at least my vote would be only to include things in the markup in which the Administration has commented consistent with their view of the budget proposal. In other words, if something were to hurt the Postal Service's ability to survive, they would likely respond that they couldn't support it in light of the budget. Doesn't mean they wouldn't necessarily like it. It just means that this is a proposal to pass a bill as part of the budget process that would support postal reform consistent with the President's budget proposal. Now, in a sense, Mr. Lynch, what I'm saying is if there were additional efficiencies, additional revenues, or necessary changes, such as Ms. Duckworth's, the whole question of the sort of the civil rights of the disabled, I want to make sure those are considered. But my goal is to pass a net cost reduction piece of legislation out of this committee to help ensure the survival of the Postal Service. I will say on the record that I recognize and support the Administration's view that we need to find breathing room, dollars, for these reforms to take hold, which means that we do have to look at CSRS as a delayed recapture, even though they are perhaps $20 billion in the rear. We do have to look at the FERS windfall as revenue that can be part of, I shouldn't say windfall, but the excess payment that can be a windfall to the Post Office as revenue that they can use as part of the conversion, because I think the Administration has said very clearly they think the fiscally responsible thing to do is to give them breathing room while also mandating that they make reforms that have been tough to make, tough for both parties. Do you have any closing guidance further?
No, I just think that what we're hitting on is that there are some things that in your proposal and in the President's proposal that I review and see as things that are indeed harmful to the survival of the Post Office. And that's why we're at this thing.
And I look forward to working with the gentleman on that. I think that one thing that you made very clear is that the attrition rate and the incentives would hopefully be something that we would come to an understanding with the administration needs to be in place, that the ability to reduce the size of the workforce through voluntary programs should be part of any package we send forward. And I think you made that point, but I'm sure there will be others. Mr. Dees, I want to thank you for being here for this short hearing. By this committee's standards, this was quick, but you were very helpful in your answers and your willingness to take back and to receive over the next week a series of letters, and if at all possible, to respond to them over the next 2 weeks so that when we come back from the Easter district work period, we could proceed with a markup consistent with the President's budget, which is the intent of the committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. We stand adjourned.